3 months ago, I stood under the bright lights of the Chicago Civic Opera House, the kind of lights so intense they blur the edges of the world and make everything beyond the stage feel distant and unreal. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume, and the low hum of 1,000 conversations blended into a single electric current that seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath my heels. I had imagined this moment in abstract terms: career milestone, recognition, achievement, but nothing prepared me for the physical weight of it. My name echoed through the theater, amplified and deliberate. Naomi Clark, youngest partner in Sterling and Rowe Consulting history. The applause rose in a wave, sharp and bright, and for a split second, my body forgot how to move. Then I stepped forward. My suit was tailored navy, sharp at the shoulders, structured in a way that made me feel taller than I actually am. I bought it myself 2 weeks earlier after staring at the price tag for a full 5 minutes, reminding myself that I no longer needed to justify investments in my own future. The stage lights reflected off the polished floor as I walked, steady, controlled, each step echoing louder than I expected. I didn't look down. I didn't rush. I let the moment stretch. From the corner of my eye, I could see the third row. That's where they were sitting. My parents, my brother Ethan between them. Their seats were prime, center aisle, clear line of sight to the stage. They had dressed for Ethan's moment. Dad in his charcoal suit, the one he reserves for important business. Mom in a soft blue dress, clutching her program like it contained something sacred. Ethan looked confident, relaxed, adjusting the cuff of his blazer the way he always does before stepping into a spotlight. They were here for him. He had been invited to speak on a breakout panel about emerging tech founders. My parents had posted about it all week. So proud of Ethan. Leadership Summit, here we come. I had seen the posts and said nothing. I had not corrected them. I had not hinted at anything. Because I wanted this to unfold exactly as it was unfolding now, without rehearsal, without warning. When my name was called, I saw the shift happen in real time. Dad's smile faltered first. It didn't disappear all at once. It flickered, like a light bulb struggling before burning out. Mom leaned forward slightly, squinting, as if she'd misheard. Ethan's posture stiffened, his head turning slowly toward the stage, confusion washing across his face. I imagined they were running through possibilities. Another Naomi Clark? Some coincidence? But no. It was me, the daughter who was supposed to be fine, the one who didn't need extra resources, the steady one, the responsible one, the low-risk option. And now I was standing under the same spotlight they had spent years angling toward someone else. As I approached the podium, I felt something unexpected. Not adrenaline, not nerves, not even triumph. It was calm, a deep, grounded calm that settled into my chest like a steady heartbeat. The audience stood in applause, the sound rolling through the opera house in waves. It wasn't polite clapping. It was sustained, deliberate recognition. I placed my notes on the podium but didn't look at them yet. Instead, I let myself take in the view from up there. The gold detailing of the balconies, the rows of dark suits and bright dresses, the glow of phone screens capturing the moment. I allowed myself one small glance toward the third row. My parents were frozen, not clapping, not speaking, just staring. And for the first time in my life, they were looking at me without comparison attached to the gaze. I thought about how many times I had imagined being seen. As a kid at science fairs when Dad would arrive late because Ethan had soccer practice. At high school award ceremonies when Mom would say, "We'll celebrate later, honey," because Ethan had something bigger happening that same week. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table at 18 while my future was reduced to a cost-benefit analysis. I remembered being described as low maintenance, as if that were a compliment instead of a dismissal. Standing there now, I realized something powerful. I wasn't there to prove them wrong. That part had already happened long before this night. I was there because I had built something substantial, something undeniable, and it had nothing to do with whether they understood it. The host stepped back. The microphone adjusted to my height. The Harrington Fellowship insignia shimmered subtly on the screen behind me, along with the Sterling and Rowe logo. My title, my credentials, my name in bold letters. Naomi Clark. No asterisk, no footnote, no Ethan's sister. Just me. The applause finally softened, tapering into a quiet expectancy. The opera house felt enormous and intimate at the same time, as if every single person present was leaning slightly forward, waiting. I wrapped my fingers around the edges of the podium, grounding myself in the cool wood. 8 years of effort had led here. 8 years of early mornings, late nights, calculated risks, silent resilience. And in the third row sat the people who once believed I didn't require investment. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel vindication. What I felt was clarity. This moment wasn't about shocking them. It wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about ownership, about stepping fully into the space I had carved out for myself. I inhaled slowly, steadying my voice before it ever had a chance to waver. When I finally leaned toward the microphone, the room fell into complete silence. "Good evening," I began, and for the first time in my life, I knew without question that I belonged exactly where I was. But long before the opera house, before the tailored suits and polished stages, there was a kitchen table in a quiet Ohio suburb, and a sentence that rearranged the architecture of my life. I was 18. Acceptance letters spread out in front of us like competing business proposals. Mine from Lakeview College, Ethan's from Crestmont University. I can still see the way the late afternoon light came through the blinds, striping the table in pale gold and shadow. Dad had that familiar analytical look on his face, the one he used when reviewing quarterly reports. Mom's hands were folded too tightly in her lap. Ethan looked excited, almost glowing, already talking about dorm layouts and engineering labs, as if the decision had been made days ago. Dad cleared his throat and said, "We've run the numbers." That's how it started. Not with pride, not with celebration, with numbers. Crestmont was $72,000 a year. Lakeview was a fraction of that. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. Comfortable enough that supporting one child fully was possible. Supporting two was apparently not strategic. "We've decided to fully fund Ethan's education," Dad said. He spoke calmly, like this was obvious, like this was simply the most rational path forward. I nodded at first. Of course. Crestmont was elite, competitive, impressive. I waited for the second half of the sentence. "And for me?" I asked. Mom's eyes flickered toward mine and then away again. "Naomi, you've always been independent," she said carefully. "Lakeview is affordable. You can take out loans, work part-time, you'll manage." Dad leaned back slightly. "Ethan's field has higher earning potential. Engineering, startups, innovation. There's more upside. You're steady, practical, finances stable. You don't need as much support." I remember staring at the wood grain of the table so hard it blurred. There was a small scratch near the corner where Ethan had once dropped a fork as a kid. I focused on that scratch like it could anchor me. "We have to invest where the returns are strongest," Dad continued. "It's not personal, it's just reality." Not personal, but it was my life. The conversation moved on quickly after that. Logistics, move-in dates, tuition deposits. I sat there while my future was quietly reclassified as self-funded. Ethan's hoodie had arrived earlier that week, Crestmont across the chest in bold navy letters. He kept smoothing it down proudly while my acceptance packet sat untouched beside me. It wasn't that they thought I would fail. That might have been easier to fight. It was that they believed I would succeed regardless, so their support wasn't necessary. They mistook resilience for invulnerability. They mistook independence for not needing anyone. That night, I went upstairs without saying much. I didn't slam doors. I didn't cry loudly enough for anyone to hear. I closed my bedroom door softly, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. I remember the screen glowing in the dim light, my hands hovering over the keyboard for a few seconds before I typed, "Full scholarships, merit-based finance students." If they were going to treat my future like a balance sheet, I would learn to operate like one. The following weeks were surreal. My parents toured Crestmont with Ethan, taking photos in front of historic brick buildings and research labs. They posted captions about "our future engineer" and "so proud of this next chapter." Meanwhile, I filled out FAFSA forms alone at the kitchen counter. I researched federal loan interest rates between shifts at my part-time retail job. I calculated how many hours I would need to work to cover textbooks, housing, meal plans. No one asked if I was scared. No one asked if I felt overwhelmed. I told myself I wasn't. Lakeview's campus was smaller, practical, efficient. It didn't have Crestmont's glossy brochures or alumni billionaire lists. But when I visited for orientation, something in me felt steady there. The buildings weren't ornate, but they were solid. The classrooms weren't cutting edge, but they were full. I walked through the business school wing and ran my fingers across the polished bulletin boards lined with internship postings. It wasn't glamorous. It was functional. And maybe that suited me. Still, the night before move-in, something cracked. Ethan's car was packed first. Brand new luggage, labeled storage bins, a mini fridge still in its box. Dad double-checked every detail. Mom fussed over bedding sets and desk lamps. I stood in the doorway of my own room, staring at the thrift store suitcase I'd bought with my savings. My bedding was from home. My laptop was 3 years old. Mom knocked gently. "You'll be fine, Naomi," she said, offering a small smile. "You've always handled things." There it was again. Fine. Handle things. I wanted to ask why being capable meant being unsupported. Why reliability meant invisibility. But the words lodged somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there. The morning they dropped Ethan off at the airport, the house felt strangely hollow afterward. I moved into Lakeview 2 days later. Dad helped carry one box up the stairs. Mom hugged me quickly in the hallway. "Call if you need anything," she said. I almost laughed. Need. I watched their car pull away from the curb and stood there for a long time. The campus buzzed around me, parents crying, students laughing nervously, cars unloading in waves. I felt very small for a moment. Not unworthy, not incapable, just alone. But somewhere in that loneliness, a quiet decision solidified. If they believed I would manage without investment, I would prove that their assumption underestimated the scale of my ambition. I wasn't going to collapse under loans or scrape by quietly. I wasn't going to become the steady, practical child who faded into the background. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this. If no one else was going to invest in me, I would. Lakeview didn't look like the kind of campus that produced headlines. It looked like the kind that produced survivors. The dorm walls were painted a dull beige that couldn't quite decide if it was trying to be warm or sterile. My roommate, Jenna, was kind but chaotic. She FaceTimed her boyfriend until 2 in the morning and left half-empty coffee cups on every surface. The first night, as I lay on my narrow twin mattress staring at the faint crack in the ceiling, I felt the full weight of what independence actually meant. There was no safety net here. No quiet transfer of funds if I miscalculated. No backup credit card tucked into a parent's wallet with my name on it. Just me, a spreadsheet I'd built, and a list of due dates. Classes started the following week, and I immediately built my life around structure. If I was going to finance this education myself, I couldn't afford inefficiency. My mornings began at 5:30 a.m. In the dining hall kitchen, hair tied back, apron on, refilling industrial coffee dispensers before most students were awake. By 8:30, I changed into business casual and headed to lectures. Afternoons were for studying or my shift at the circulation desk in the library. Evenings, twice a week, I tutored introductory statistics for students who had the luxury of treating the class as a nuisance rather than a necessity. By Friday, my body usually hummed with exhaustion, but I had learned to ignore it. Fatigue was cheaper than failure. The first semester was an adjustment in more ways than one. In my finance classes, I noticed something immediately. Confidence often walked in wearing privilege. Students who had parents in banking or private equity spoke easily about markets and venture capital. They referenced dinner table conversations about IPOs. I referenced textbooks. At first, I mistook their ease for superiority. But after a few weeks, I realized something important. They weren't necessarily smarter. They were simply familiar. Exposure looks like talent when you don't know the difference. I compensated with preparation. I read ahead. I built flashcards. I watched lectures twice. When grades were posted after midterms, my name sat at the top of the list in corporate accounting, 98%. The professor paused in class the next day and said, "Miss, Clark set the curve this time." A few students turned to look at me. I felt heat rush to my face. For a second, I wanted to disappear. Then I straightened my posture instead. At night, when the dorm grew quiet, I sometimes opened social media against my better judgment. Crestmont's campus looked cinematic in comparison. Arched stone buildings, tech expos, Ethan smiling in photos beside students in branded sweatshirts. My parents commented under every post, "So proud." Keep reaching for the stars. I'd scroll, feel the familiar pinch in my chest, then close the app and return to my spreadsheets. I wasn't competing with Ethan. I was competing with the version of myself that might shrink under comparison. By sophomore year, the rhythm hardened into routine. I added a third job assisting a graduate research project for a professor who needed data analysis support. It paid modestly, but gave me something more valuable: access. I learned how academic research intersected with financial modeling. I learned how to present findings concisely. I learned that proximity to opportunity matters. Sleep averaged 5 hours. Coffee averaged 4 cups. I stopped going home for long weekends because gas cost money and every missed shift meant lost income. When my parents called, the conversations were polite and surface level. How are classes? Good. Busy? Very. Ethan's updates usually followed. His internship, his coding competition, his networking trip to San Francisco. I listened. I congratulated him. I never mentioned the nights I ate instant noodles because groceries had to stretch until payday. Not out of pride, out of calculation. I had stopped expecting emotional returns. It was during the second semester of sophomore year that something shifted. Professor Daniel Kim taught advanced corporate finance. He had a reputation for being demanding but fair. His lectures were dense, layered with real-world case studies, and he had a habit of cold calling students without warning. Most avoided eye contact. I didn't. One afternoon, after I'd walked through a particularly complex valuation model on the board, he stopped me as I was gathering my notebook. "Naomi, do you have a minute?" My immediate thought was that I'd made a mistake. Inside his office, books were stacked in precarious towers. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "You're operating at a level beyond this curriculum," he said plainly. I blinked. "I just study a lot." "That's not what I mean," he replied. "You think in frameworks. You anticipate variables. That's instinct layered with discipline." No one had ever described me that way. He asked about my plans after graduation. I told him I intended to work immediately. Loans weren't optional. He nodded slowly. "You should consider competitive fellowships," he said. "Harrington, for example." I laughed reflexively. "That's for the top 1%. He held my gaze. "And what do you think you are?" The question unsettled me more than any exam. That night, I sat at my small dorm desk and pulled up the Harrington Fellowship website. Full funding for graduate study, placement into top consulting firms, 10 recipients nationwide. The application required essays on leadership, resilience, and long-term impact. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. Leadership? I wasn't president of any flashy club. Resilience? That felt too personal. Impact? I was still paying tuition in installments. But as I scrolled through past recipients, I noticed something. They weren't carbon copies of each other. They weren't all tech prodigies or legacy admits. Some had worked multiple jobs. Some had overcome systemic obstacles. What they shared wasn't pedigree. It was narrative clarity. I began drafting my first essay at 11:48 p.m. after a double shift. "I learned the language of investment before I learned the language of self-worth," I wrote. The sentence surprised me. Over the next 3 months, my schedule tightened further. Classes, jobs, fellowship essays, mock interviews with Professor Kim. I rewrote drafts until verbs felt precise and every paragraph carried weight. I didn't tell my parents, not because I wanted to hide success, but because I refused to pre-negotiate disappointment. There were nights I questioned the effort. 10 winners out of thousands. The math wasn't promising. But I had spent 2 years building proof of concept, a 4.0 GPA, research experience, leadership and tutoring initiatives, data-backed results. If markets misprice assets based on incomplete information, then maybe the world had mispriced me too. The final application was submitted at 2:07 a.m. on a Sunday. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, exhaustion settling into my bones. Outside my dorm window, campus was silent. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if this was arrogance? What if I was reaching beyond my category? Then I remembered the kitchen table. We have to invest where the returns are strongest. Maybe they had miscalculated, and maybe I was about to prove it. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February while I was restocking pastries at the dining hall. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my apron, and I almost ignored it. Notifications during a shift usually meant nothing urgent. Group chats, campus alerts, promotional spam. But something compelled me to check. I stepped into the storage hallway, flour dust clinging to my sleeves, and pulled out my phone. Subject line, Harrington Fellowship, final decision. My heart didn't race. It stalled. For a second, I just stared at the words, as if looking too quickly might change them. I wiped my hands on my apron, unlocked the screen, and opened the email. Dear Miss Clark, we are pleased to inform you. I didn't read the rest immediately. I didn't need to. My knees actually buckled. I leaned back against a metal shelf stacked with paper goods and let the words wash over me in fragments. Selected as a 2022 Harrington Fellow. Full funding for MBA at Northwestern. Leadership Summit keynote address. Professional placement pathway. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. Somewhere beyond the hallway, dishes clattered and students laughed, unaware that my entire future had just tilted on its axis. I slid down to sit on the cold tile floor and pressed my palm over my mouth to keep from making a sound. I wasn't crying delicately. I was shaking. Years of quiet pressure cracked open at once. Every shift worked. Every night I chose studying over sleep. Every moment I told myself to keep going because no one else was coming to rescue me. Someone had seen me, not as the steady one, not as the safe bet, as potential. I finished my shift in a daze. I don't remember how many cups of coffee I poured or how many trays I wiped down. The world felt both louder and softer at the same time. When I finally stepped outside into the winter air, the cold hit my face sharply, grounding me. I called Professor Kim first. He picked up on the second ring. Tell me. I laughed, breathless. You already know. I was hoping I did, he said. I could hear the smile in his voice. Congratulations, Naomi, you earned this. Earned. The word meant more than he probably realized. That afternoon, I skipped my library shift for the first time in 2 years and walked across campus without a destination. The buildings looked different, somehow. Not smaller, just less intimidating. I wasn't just surviving here anymore. I was launching. I did not call my parents. I sat with that decision deliberately. Part of me wanted to. I imagined how it might go. Dad calculating the prestige factor, Mom exclaiming how proud they were, Ethan asking logistical questions. But another part of me knew something uncomfortable. I didn't want their validation to be the loudest reaction in my mind, so I waited. The next months were a blur of transition. I finished my final undergraduate semester with the same disciplined intensity, graduated summa cum laude, and moved to Evanston to begin my MBA at Northwestern that fall. Northwestern felt different from Lakeview the moment I arrived. The campus buzzed with ambition. Conversations revolved around venture capital, global markets, consulting offers. Students arrived with resumes already stacked, previous analyst roles, international internships, family businesses. The old insecurity tried to resurface. You don't belong here. But this time I had evidence to counter it. Harrington Fellow, full merit selection, national keynote speaker. I wasn't here by accident. I was here because a national committee had decided my trajectory mattered. The MBA program was intense in a way that felt almost athletic. Case competitions ran late into the night. Networking events required strategic conversations. I bought my first professional wardrobe piece that wasn't from a discount rack. I practiced elevator pitches in the mirror of my tiny studio apartment. Money still mattered, but differently now. The fellowship stipend covered living expenses. For the first time since I was 18, I wasn't calculating whether I could afford groceries. That shift changed something internal. When survival pressure eases, your brain has space to expand. I began thinking not just about making it through, but about where I wanted to lead. Midway through my first MBA year, the Harrington Foundation contacted me about the Leadership Summit. As part of the fellowship, recipients delivered a keynote at the Midwest Business Leadership Summit, an event attended by corporate executives, investors, founders, and media outlets. It was a big stage, bigger than anything I had done before. I was 24 when I began drafting that speech. At first, I tried to make it purely strategic, data-heavy, market-focused, safe. But every time I rehearsed it, something felt hollow. It sounded like I was trying to mimic the tone of people who had never questioned whether they belonged. One evening, sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor with notes scattered around me, I scrapped the draft entirely. I started again. I wrote about being underestimated, about how markets misprice value when they rely on incomplete information, about how talent doesn't always announce itself with confidence. It often grows quietly under constraint. The words felt real this time. Meanwhile, Ethan's trajectory was accelerating too. His startup secured additional funding. He was invited to speak on a tech innovation panel at the same summit. My parents were ecstatic. "We'll all be there," Mom said during one of our calls. "It'll be so exciting to see Ethan on stage." I let her continue. I did not interrupt. They assumed I would attend as a fellow alumna in the audience. They had no idea I was scheduled as the closing keynote. The summit approached quickly. Sterling and Rowe Consulting recruited heavily from the event, and during my final MBA semester, they extended me an offer, associate track with fast promotion potential. I accepted. The night before the summit, I stood in front of my apartment mirror in Chicago, now relocated for work, and rehearsed the opening line of my speech one last time. The city skyline glittered beyond my window. I thought about the 18-year-old version of me staring at a scratched kitchen table, quietly absorbing the message that she was the secondary investment. If she could see me now. The morning of the summit, I arrived early at the Civic Opera House. The interior was breathtaking. Arched ceilings, gold detailing, velvet seats stretching in endless rows. I walked onto the empty stage for sound check and looked out at the silent auditorium. Tomorrow, it would be full. I felt the familiar calm settle in my chest. This wasn't about shocking anyone. It wasn't even about my parents. It was about claiming the space I had earned. That evening, as I reviewed the final program schedule, I saw it printed clearly. Breakout panel, Emerging Tech Founders, Ethan Clark. Closing keynote, Harrington Fellow, Naomi Clark. 2 names, same last name, very different journeys. And by the time the lights came up the next night, only one of those journeys would redefine the narrative. The night of the summit felt suspended in glass. Sharp, reflective, impossible to ignore. Backstage at the Chicago Civic Opera House, I stood in a narrow corridor lined with velvet curtains, listening to the muffled cadence of the speaker before me. My palms weren't sweaty, my breathing wasn't uneven. The nerves I'd expected never fully arrived. Instead, there was a grounded stillness in my chest, the kind that comes when you've already survived the hardest parts long before anyone hands you a microphone. Earlier that evening, I'd watched Ethan's breakout panel from a monitor backstage. He looked confident, animated, speaking about scalable tech solutions and investor confidence. The audience responded well. My parents were seated front and center, leaning forward, pride practically radiating off them. I saw my mother dab at her eyes once when someone introduced him as a visionary founder. Dad recorded half the panel on his phone. They had no idea I was standing 50 feet away behind a curtain, waiting for my own introduction. When the panel ended, the program shifted into closing remarks. The house lights dimmed slightly, and the announcer's voice filled the opera house. And now, it is my honor to introduce this year's Harrington Fellow, youngest partner in Sterling and Rowe Consulting history. I felt the words move through the space before they fully registered. Please welcome Naomi Clark. The applause started polite, then swelled as I stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding at first, turning the audience into silhouettes, but as my eyes adjusted, faces came into focus row by row. Third row, center aisle, my family. The moment recognition hit them was slow and almost cinematic. My father's phone lowered inch by inch, my mother's mouth parted slightly, confusion flickering across her expression before transforming into stunned realization. Ethan's posture changed entirely, shoulders squaring, eyes narrowing as he processed the screen behind me, displaying my name and title. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally be seen. I expected a rush of vindication, maybe even satisfaction. What I felt instead was something quieter. Clarity. I walked to the podium and placed my notes down, though I barely glanced at them. The applause faded gradually, the room settling into attentive silence. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady through the microphone. It carried. That alone felt surreal. I spoke first about markets, about how valuation depends on perception, and how perception is often flawed. I referenced data points, industry patterns, investment bias. It was safe territory, familiar. The audience nodded along, executives scribbling notes. Then I shifted. But markets aren't the only places where value gets miscalculated, I said. Sometimes we underestimate people the same way we underestimate assets, based on incomplete information, assumptions, or convenience. The opera house grew quieter. I learned early what it feels like to be considered the safe option, the one who will manage, the one who doesn't require extra resources, the steady choice. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. Being underestimated can either shrink you, I continued, or it can sharpen you. The words flowed more naturally now, no longer rehearsed but lived. I chose to treat doubt like leverage. Every time someone assumed I would be fine without support, I treated it as proof that I needed to invest in myself even more aggressively. A few heads in the audience tilted forward. The energy shifted from corporate interest to something more personal. I worked through college. I applied for opportunities that statistically didn't favor me. I stopped waiting for external validation to determine my worth. My chest felt light as I said it. I'm not here tonight because someone believed in me first. I'm here because I learned to believe in myself when no one else prioritized it. There it was. Not accusatory, not bitter, just true. I saw movement in the third row, my mother pressing her fingers against her lips, my father staring at the stage in a way I had never seen before. Ethan's expression wasn't defensive. It was contemplative. I ended the speech the way I had rewritten it months ago on my apartment floor. Sometimes the strongest returns don't come from the most obvious investments, I said. They come from the overlooked ones. The assets that required patience, resilience, and faith long before anyone else recognized their value. The final line left my mouth calmly. And if you've ever been underestimated, remember this. Your worth isn't determined by who invests in you. It's determined by what you build when no one does. Silence. Then applause. Not scattered clapping. A full, rising ovation that rolled through the opera house like thunder. People stood. Some executives in the front row nodded with a kind of respect that felt different from admiration. It felt earned. I stepped back from the podium and let the moment breathe. When I exited the stage, my pulse finally quickened, not from anxiety, but from the realization that something irreversible had just happened. Not career-wise. Personally. Backstage, members of the Harrington Foundation congratulated me. A partner from Sterling and Rowe clasped my shoulder and said, "That's leadership." I smiled, thanked them, kept my composure. Then I saw my family weaving through the crowd in the reception hall. Dad reached me first. "Naomi," he said, voice unsteady. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question landed softly, not accusatory, more disoriented. I met his eyes evenly. "You didn't ask." Mom's mascara had smudged slightly. We thought you were doing well. We just didn't realize that I was doing this," I finished gently. Ethan stepped forward. "I didn't know you were speaking," he said. Not defensive, just factual. "I know," I replied. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just an uncomfortable recalibration. Dad inhaled slowly. "I was wrong," he said. The words seemed physically difficult for him. About a lot of things. I didn't rush to fill the silence. For years, I had imagined needing this apology, thought it would unlock something immediate inside me. But standing there, champagne glasses clinking in the background, applause still echoing faintly in my ears, I realized something unexpected. I didn't need their admission to validate what I already knew. "I don't hate you," I said calmly, "but I don't need your approval anymore." It wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. My mother's shoulders dropped slightly as if absorbing the weight of that statement. Ethan looked at me differently now, not as competition, not as background, as equal. The power dynamic had shifted quietly but permanently. That night, when I returned to my apartment overlooking the city lights, I took off my heels and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. The opera house applause replayed in my head, not because it was loud, but because it was collective recognition. For the first time, I hadn't been standing in anyone's shadow. And I hadn't stepped into the spotlight to prove something. I stepped into it because I belonged there. The morning after the summit, I woke up earlier than usual, even though I'd barely slept. The city outside my apartment window was already in motion. Taxis weaving through traffic, pedestrians rushing with coffee cups in hand, sunlight reflecting off the glass towers across the river. For a moment, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting the events of the night before settle into something solid instead of surreal. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Missed calls, text messages. Notifications stacked in layers. Colleagues, Harrington Foundation board members, 2 partners from Sterling and Rowe, even a LinkedIn message from someone I didn't know saying, "Your speech resonated more than you realize." And then 3 texts from Mom, 1 from Dad, 1 from Ethan. I didn't open them right away. Instead, I got up, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the steam rise from the mug. The stillness of the apartment felt intentional. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for anything. I wasn't calculating tuition payments or work shifts. I wasn't preparing for an exam. I was simply standing in the quiet of something I had earned. Eventually, I opened Mom's first message. "We are so proud of you." I don't even know what to say. The second, "I'm sorry we didn't understand sooner." Dad's message was shorter. "Can we talk today?" Ethan's read, "I owe you coffee." And probably more than that. I set the phone down again. I didn't feel anger reading their words. I didn't feel triumph either. What I felt was distance, not physical, but emotional. Like I was observing a chapter of my life from a slightly elevated perspective, no longer fully inside it. Later that afternoon, I agreed to meet them at a small cafe near Millennium Park. Neutral ground, public, bright, no heavy dining table between us. When I walked in, they were already seated. My mother stood first, hesitating before stepping toward me like she wasn't sure what kind of hug would be appropriate. I gave her a brief one. Dad remained seated for a second too long, then stood as well. "You were incredible," he said. His voice lacked its usual certainty. "Thank you," I replied. We ordered coffee. The barista called out names. The normalcy of the setting contrasted sharply with the emotional tension at our table. Dad cleared his throat. "I've been thinking all night," he began, "about what you said, about how we handled things when you were 18. I let him continue. "We thought we were being practical," he said. "Strategic. We didn't realize how it sounded or what it meant." "It meant," I said calmly, "that I wasn't worth the same investment." Mom winced slightly. "That's not what we meant," she whispered, "but it's what happened." There it was, the distinction between intention and impact. Ethan leaned forward. "I honestly didn't see it," he admitted. "I thought you were just okay with everything." "I wasn't," I said. "I just stopped asking." The table fell quiet. I didn't want to turn the moment into a courtroom. I didn't need to list every missed event, every underplayed achievement, every quiet dismissal. They knew enough now. The shock of seeing me on that stage had done what years of conversations hadn't. Dad looked older than I remembered. Not physically frail, just less rigid. "I underestimated you," he said plainly, "and I'm sorry." The apology landed differently this time. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't wrapped in justification. I studied his face for a moment. "You didn't underestimate my ability," I said. "You underestimated my need." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Mom reached across the table, tentative. "We want to do better," she said. "If you'll let us." There it was, the question underneath everything. Would I let them back in? For years, I had imagined cutting them off completely. I had rehearsed speeches about independence, about self-sufficiency. But sitting there, I realized something more nuanced. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want distance for the sake of proving strength. What I wanted was boundaries. "I'm not angry," I said carefully, "but I'm not going back to who I was before either." Dad nodded. "Fair." "If we're going to rebuild anything," I continued, "it has to be different. No comparisons. No assumptions that I'm fine just because I'm capable. If you want to know how I'm doing, ask and listen." Mom's eyes filled. "We can do that." Ethan exhaled. "I can do that too." I believed him. The dynamic had shifted. Not because I'd stood on a stage, but because I'd stopped chasing their approval long enough to define myself without it. After coffee, we walked along the lakefront for a few minutes. The wind off Lake Michigan was sharp, tugging at coats and hair. For the first time in years, the silence between us wasn't strained. It was tentative, yes, but open. Back at my apartment that evening, I reflected on how much had changed in less than 24 hours. Not externally, my job was still my job. My title still the same. But internally, something had recalibrated. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for praise, not for recognition, not for fairness retroactively applied. I had already built the life I wanted. Over the next few weeks, our communication shifted subtly. Mom began texting more frequently, not to comment on Ethan's updates, but to ask about mine. Dad called once just to ask how a client presentation had gone. Ethan and I met for coffee without the competitive undertone that had once hovered unspoken between us. Healing wasn't dramatic, it didn't erase history, but it was visible in small, consistent efforts. One afternoon, about a month after the summit, I received official confirmation of my promotion to partner at Sterling and Rowe, effective immediately, the youngest in firm history. I printed the email and placed it in a folder in my desk, not to send to my parents, not to prove anything, just as a reminder. The 18-year-old version of me who sat at that kitchen table thinking she was the secondary investment, she would have never imagined this level of ownership. And maybe that's the quiet truth of it all. I didn't win because they changed their minds. I won because I stopped letting their calculations define my value. And now, any relationship we rebuild will be based on something entirely different. Not obligation, not hierarchy. Respect. 6 months after the summit, my life looked stable from the outside. Structured calendar, partner meetings, polished presentations, early mornings that began with espresso instead of anxiety. But internally, something quieter was still unfolding. Success had settled into routine, yet the emotional recalibration with my family was ongoing, uneven in places, unexpectedly tender in others. Work at Sterling and Rowe accelerated quickly. Being the youngest partner meant scrutiny came packaged with congratulations. Senior partners watched closely to see whether I would justify the title or shrink under it. I didn't shrink. If anything, I felt sharper. Years of operating without a safety net had trained me for high-pressure rooms. Client negotiations felt less intimidating than sitting at that kitchen table at 18. But achievement has a strange way of exposing old narratives. There were moments in conference rooms, polished mahogany tables, projections glowing against the wall, when I'd catch a flicker of the old voice. You're only here because you had something to prove. I had to consciously counter it. I wasn't here because of defiance. I was here because I was competent. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family shifted in incremental steps. Mom began calling once a week, not to update me on Ethan's progress, but to ask specific questions about my life. How did the client meeting go? Are you sleeping enough? Have you made friends outside of work? At first, the attention felt almost unfamiliar, like wearing a jacket that didn't quite fit. I answered cautiously, waiting for the conversation to pivot back to something else. But it didn't. She listened. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes too emotionally, but she listened. Dad's evolution was slower. He didn't default to vulnerability easily. Instead, he asked practical questions about market trends, about my strategy at the firm, about leadership decisions. At first, it felt like another evaluation. But over time, I realized something subtle. He wasn't assessing me. He was trying to understand me. One evening, about 8 months after the summit, he called unexpectedly. "I've been reviewing some old financial plans," he said without preamble. "College projections, retirement allocations." I smiled faintly. "Classic Dad." "I keep thinking about how I framed things back then," he continued. "Returns, upside, risk." I waited. "I reduced you to a forecast," he said quietly, "and I never asked what you wanted. The admission hung between us. I wanted to be supported," I said gently, "not predicted." Silence on the line. "I know," he replied. "I see that now." There was no grand emotional breakthrough, but something about that acknowledgement, unprompted, reflective, felt meaningful. Ethan and I navigated our own recalibration. We met monthly for coffee when his work brought him to Chicago. The first few meetings were polite, almost overly balanced, like we were both trying not to tip the scales of old dynamics. One afternoon, sitting across from him in a crowded cafe, he leaned back and said, "You know, I used to think you didn't care about any of it." "About what?" "Competition. Comparison. I thought you just opted out." I laughed softly. "I didn't opt out. I just stopped playing the game." He nodded slowly. I think I was too busy benefiting from it to notice. There was no defensiveness in his voice, just recognition. We began talking about things beyond career metrics, books, travel, relationships. For the first time, I saw him not as the favored child, but as a person shaped by expectations just as heavily as I was. He had carried pressure to justify the investment. I had carried pressure to survive without one. Different weights, same structure. The biggest internal shift, though, came one quiet Saturday afternoon in my apartment. I was reviewing quarterly reports when I received an email from Lakeview College's development office. They were launching a scholarship fund for first-generation and self-funded business students. The message invited alumni contributions. I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought about 18-year-old me filling out FAFSA forms alone, about counting grocery receipts, about walking across campus, calculating hours worked versus tuition owed. I opened a new tab and reviewed my savings account. The partner bonus from that quarter had already cleared. I could afford it. Without overthinking it, I wrote a check for $25,000. Anonymous? I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't even post about it. When I emailed the development office confirming the donation, I felt something deeper than pride. It wasn't about generosity. It was about continuity, about interrupting the narrative that someone has to be deprioritized for another to succeed. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten thank you letter from a sophomore finance major named Alina. She wrote about working 2 campus jobs and nearly dropping out before the scholarship eased her burden. "I don't know who you are," she wrote, "but you changed my trajectory." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. That night, I called Professor Kim. "You once asked me what I thought I was," I reminded him. "And?" he asked. "I think I'm someone who doesn't let miscalculations stand." He laughed softly. "That sounds about right." The longer I lived inside this new version of my life, the more I understood something essential. Reconciliation doesn't mean regression. Forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. My parents visited Chicago that fall. We had dinner in a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. There were no grand apologies this time. No emotional speeches, just conversation. About my upcoming client pitch, about Mom's new volunteer project, about Ethan's latest product launch. At one point, Dad looked around the restaurant, then at me. "You built this," he said simply. "Yes," I replied. And that was enough. Driving them back to their hotel later, I felt neither resentment nor longing. I felt equilibrium. The girl who once measured herself against parental approval had grown into a woman who measured herself against her own standards. And the most surprising part? When I stopped needing to prove my worth, I finally began to experience it, fully, quietly, without comparison. Not as the underestimated one, not as the overlooked one, just as Naomi. 2 years have passed since the night I stood beneath the Opera House lights and watched my family see me clearly for the first time. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, but it doesn't erase the lines completely. What it does, if you let it, is give you perspective. I'm 28 now. Sterling and Rowe no longer introduces me as the youngest partner. I'm just one of the partners. The novelty faded. The work didn't. My calendar is still relentless, my inbox still overflows, and the stakes are higher than ever. But the difference between now and the girl who once counted grocery dollars in a dorm room is internal. I no longer operate from scarcity. I operate from intention. Success feels different when it's not fueled by proving someone wrong. It took me a while to understand that. For the first year after the summit, I ran on momentum. Promotions, recognition, invitations to speak on panels about leadership and resilience. Each accomplishment felt like another quiet rebuttal to that kitchen table conversation years ago. But eventually, the adrenaline faded. And when it did, I had to confront a question I'd avoided. Who am I if I'm not fighting to be seen? The answer surprised me. I'm thoughtful, strategic, sometimes too hard on myself. I like early morning walks by the lake. I read more nonfiction than fiction. I prefer small dinner gatherings to loud networking events. I'm ambitious, but not because I need to outpace someone else, because I genuinely enjoy building things that work. That shift from reaction to creation has been the most meaningful transformation of all. My relationship with my parents now exists in a space I would describe as cautious but sincere. They call regularly. They visit Chicago a few times a year. They've learned, slowly, to ask instead of assume. Mom no longer says, "You're fine." She says, "How are you really?" Dad doesn't talk about returns and projections when it comes to me. He talks about pride. Quietly, sometimes awkwardly, but genuinely. We don't pretend the past didn't happen. We also don't relive it constantly. It sits there, acknowledged, no longer dictating the present. Ethan and I have found a rhythm I never thought possible. Without the old hierarchy hovering between us, we've built something closer to partnership. He admitted once, over coffee, that he carried pressure I never saw, the burden of justifying being the investment. I didn't realize you were carrying the opposite, he said. We both were, just in different directions. Last winter, he invited me to speak to his startup team about strategic growth modeling. I stood in his office conference room, whiteboards filled with code diagrams, and explained risk assessment frameworks. When the meeting ended, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're the smartest person I know." There was no competition in his voice, just respect. The scholarship fund at Lakeview has grown too. What began as a single anonymous donation has turned into an annual commitment. I eventually removed the anonymity, not for recognition, but for transparency. Students now know the scholarship was created by someone who once worked campus jobs to pay tuition. Every year, I meet the recipients. This year, a sophomore named Marcus told me, "I used to think people like you were just built different." I smiled. "No," I told him, "people like me were just underestimated." Sometimes I think about the 18-year-old version of myself, the girl sitting silently at the kitchen table while her future was discussed like a portfolio allocation. I wish I could sit beside her now and tell her what I know. That being steady is not the same as being small. That independence should not be confused with invisibility. That someone else's miscalculation does not define your market value. But I also know something else now. She didn't need rescuing. She needed time. Time to build, time to sharpen. Time to realize that validation from others is temporary, but belief in yourself compounds. There are still moments, quiet ones, when a flicker of the old ache surfaces. Family photos where I remember feeling peripheral. Celebrations where I once felt like an afterthought. Those memories don't vanish just because the ending improved. But they no longer control the narrative. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a single decision. It's a gradual release. It's choosing not to relitigate old wounds every time you remember them. It's allowing people to evolve without demanding perfection from them or from yourself. I haven't forgiven blindly. I've forgiven with boundaries. And that distinction matters. Last month, I was invited back to the Midwest Business Leadership Summit, not as a fellow, not as a surprise reveal, but as a featured speaker on sustainable leadership models. When I stepped onto that stage again, the energy felt different. Familiar, but lighter. This time, my parents sat in the audience knowing exactly why I was there. They didn't look shocked. They looked proud. After the event, Mom hugged me tightly and whispered, "We see you." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. Walking back to my apartment that night, heels in hand, city lights reflecting off the river, I realized something that would have sounded impossible years ago. I don't resent the path anymore. Not because it was fair, but because it made me self-sufficient in a way comfort never could have. I built my confidence without applause. I built my competence without cushioning. I built my identity without waiting for permission. And if there's one thing I know with absolute certainty now, it's this. Your worth is not a negotiation. It is not a projection. It is not dependent on who invests first. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is invest in yourself long before anyone else understands why. I did, and I would again.